Has America just started redrawing the map of the modern world without asking anyone's permission? From Greenland's frozen north to the Panama Canal's tropical choke point, a brand new vision of the continent is being laid out in Washington, and most people have no idea what it really means. Inside the halls of power, officials are now openly talking about something they call Greater North America, a strategic belt that stretches from the Arctic down through Canada and the United States all the way to the narrow strip of water that connects the Atlantic and the Pacific. This isn't some fringe conspiracy floating around the internet, and it isn't just loud campaign talk meant to impress crowds at rallies. The language is coming from the president himself, from his inner circle, and from his own Secretary of Defense, who has publicly described a new map of American power, covering Greenland, Canada, Mexico, and the Panama Canal. So what exactly is this so-called Greater North America? Why is it emerging now, in Trump's second term, at a moment when the United States is already stretched by wars, debt, and growing rivalry with China and Russia? And most importantly, where does this new doctrine actually end? To understand that, you have to go back to the world America built after the last Great War. When World War II ended in 1945, the United States stepped out of the ruins as the dominant economic and military power on the planet. Washington helped write the rules of the new international system, the United Nations, modern diplomacy, and the idea that borders were supposed to be fixed, not something big countries could casually rewrite. On paper, the message was simple. Every nation had the right to choose its own path, and no power could just march into a weaker neighbor and claim its territory. In reality, it was never that clean. The US backed coups, funded rebels, and intervened around the world whenever it felt its interests were on the line, from Latin America to the Middle East. But at least publicly, the basic architecture stayed the same. Borders mattered, treaties mattered, and overt territorial expansion was supposed to be off the table. Fast forward to the mid-2020s, and that framework is being challenged. Not by some isolated dictatorship, but by the very country that spent decades enforcing it. The United States is now flirting with the language of annexation, reclamation, and spheres of control in a way that feels strangely familiar to the 19th century, not the 21st. And at the center of that shift is one phrase, Greater North America. Inside the new administration, a bold idea has taken shape, that the United States should dominate a continuous belt of territory and influence running from Greenland down to the Panama Canal. In public comments, Trump has revived his old interest in acquiring Greenland, hinted at taking back control of the Panama Canal, and joked less and less playfully about Canada making a nice 51st state. Reports and speeches frame this as part of a larger plan, a Greater North America, designed to lock down critical shipping lanes, natural resources, and strategic geography before China and Russia can entrench themselves in the region. Trump's Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has gone even further, describing a new strategic map that links Greenland, Canada, the continental United States, Mexico, and the Panama Canal into a single American-centered sphere. Supporters present this as a hard-headed response to a dangerous world, secure what's nearby, control the key choke points, and keep rival powers out of the Western Hemisphere at any cost. But this isn't just talk. Behind the scenes and in public policy, the language of Greater North America has been matched with aggressive moves, tightening economic pressure on Cuba, saber-rattling over Panama, threats and bargaining over Greenland, and pressure on Canada. The doctrine is already reshaping lives, and nowhere is that clearer than on an island that has been on Washington's radar for more than half a century. Cuba has lived under some form of US embargo since 1960, but the latest phase of pressure has pushed the island to one of its worst crises since the collapse of the Soviet Union. In recent years, Washington used sanctions and informal restrictions to choke off fuel supplies, blocking or discouraging shipments from key partners and turning energy into a tool of political leverage. The result was brutal. Fuel shortages, long lines, and rolling blackouts that left ordinary Cubans in the dark, literally. Hospitals struggled to keep equipment running, public transport stalled, and daily life became a battle against shortages rather than politics. For many people on the island, it wasn't about ideologies or speeches. It was about whether the lights would stay on long enough to cook, to study, or to perform surgery. Then, in a twist that grabbed headlines, Russian tankers carrying crude oil sailed toward Cuba, with Washington briefly allowing one shipment to reach the island despite its broader blockade posture. Officials framed this as a limited exception amid wider turmoil in global energy markets. But the political symbolism was impossible to ignore, Moscow riding in as a lifeline while Washington squeezed. Analysts say this kind of pressure campaign fits perfectly with the Greater North America mindset. Punish regimes that lean toward rival powers and make it costly for outside players to gain a foothold in America's backyard. But here's the catch. Instead of collapsing, the government in Havana has often used outside pressure to rally support, while Russia's role on the island grows more visible. And if Cuba is the testing ground for energy coercion, another tiny strip of land is the test case for something even bigger, the idea of taking back a piece of history. The Panama Canal is one of the most valuable pieces of infrastructure on Earth, a shortcut that saves ships weeks of sailing and billions in costs every year. For most of the 20th century, it was under direct American control, a symbol of U.S. engineering power and a reminder of the era when Washington could dictate terms in Central America. That changed at the end of the century, when a treaty signed under President Jimmy Carter transferred full control of the canal back to Panama. At the time, many celebrated it as proof that even great powers could step back gracefully, honoring sovereignty instead of clinging to old colonial arrangements. Today, Trump has shaken that assumption by suggesting the United States has a right, or at least a reason, to retake control. His argument leans heavily on China. Over the past decade, Chinese companies have won contracts at ports and logistics hubs on both ends of the canal, feeding concerns in Washington that Beijing could gain too much leverage over a critical artery of global trade. Trump has mused openly about terminating the existing canal treaty, casting Chinese activity as a direct challenge and hinting that the U.S. might need to assert itself more forcefully. Rumors and commentary around this have fueled speculation that the Greater North America Doctrine isn't just about influence, it could be about reclaiming hard assets that once flew the American flag. Panama, for its part, insists the canal is sovereign and will remain so, and experts overwhelmingly say any attempt to forcibly reverse that would trigger a massive international backlash. Diplomats in Europe and Latin America see something deeper here. If the U.S. feels entitled to reclaim territory or infrastructure it used to control, the entire post-war system of borders and treaties starts to look less permanent. And if that makes distant observers uneasy, for America's closest neighbors, the implications cut even closer to home. For Canada, the idea of being folded into a Greater North America isn't just abstract geopolitics. It touches identity, pride, and history. Trump has repeatedly joked, and at times seemed serious, about Canada becoming the 51st state, using tariffs and trade leverage in ways that hint at economic coercion to bend Ottawa's will. Analysts point out that while this is incredibly unlikely to happen in reality, the very suggestion has already damaged public opinion and trust across the border. Canada is not just another country, it's a NATO ally, a Five Eyes intelligence partner, and America's largest trading partner, deeply integrated in everything from energy to manufacturing. When talk turns to absorbing a neighbor like that, even in half-jest, it reinforces the fear that the Greater North America vision sees allies less as partners and more as assets to be managed. Then there's Greenland. During Trump's first term, the idea of buying Greenland from Denmark sounded like one of his more outlandish suggestions, drawing ridicule and memes online. But over time, his tone hardened, framing control of Greenland as an absolute necessity for U.S. security and hinting that Washington could one day present Denmark with an offer it would struggle to refuse. Greenland's value is obvious to any strategist: Arctic routes opening due to melting ice, rare earth minerals, and a vantage point between North America and Europe. When a superpower starts talking about acquiring such a territory and refuses to rule out pressure or military options in broader rhetoric, the rest of the alliance pays attention. European officials have quietly warned that pushing too hard on Greenland, or treating Canada as a bargaining chip, risks fracturing NATO and undermining the very networks that give Washington its global edge. So why take that risk at all? To answer that, you have to look at the bigger chessboard and the anxieties driving the doctrine in the first place. At its core, the Greater North America idea is built on fear, not of some small neighboring country, but of the rising power of China and the persistent challenge of Russia. China's Belt and Road Initiative has poured money into ports, highways, and railways across Latin America, giving Beijing a growing footprint in what used to be seen as Washington's uncontested backyard. Russia, despite sanctions and diplomatic isolation, still looks for ways to project influence in the Caribbean and the wider region, from military cooperation to energy deals. From this perspective, the logic behind Greater North America sounds straightforward. If the US doesn't lock down the hemisphere now, rival powers will. Control Greenland to watch the Arctic, keep a tight grip on the Panama Canal to control global shipping, pressure Cuba so Russia can't turn it into a permanent outpost, and remind Canada and Mexico who really sets the rules. Some supporters frame it as a modern, turbocharged version of the old Monroe Doctrine, the 19th century policy that warned European powers to stay out of the Americas. But there's a critical difference between telling outsiders to back off and hinting you might redraw borders or reclaim assets from your own allies. This is where the doctrine starts to look self-defeating. By threatening Canada, you alarm the very partner you rely on most. By stirring up anxiety over Greenland, you shake trust inside NATO. By squeezing Cuba so hard that Russia looks like the rescuer, you give your rival a propaganda victory and a larger role near your shores. In other words, the strategy seems to correctly diagnose the problem, rising competition, but then picks a set of tools that risk making that competition worse. And behind all of this sits another uncomfortable reality. American power has limits. History is full of empires that believed they could keep stretching their reach forever, right up until the moment everything snapped. From Rome to the British Empire to the Soviet Union, the pattern was similar. Expansion outpaced resources, resistance grew, and the cost of control became higher than the benefits. Many historians today warn that the United States, while still incredibly powerful, is no longer in the position it held in 1945 or even in 1991. The country carries a massive national debt, faces domestic polarization, and is already committed to expensive military and diplomatic projects in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Layering an aggressive continental doctrine on top of that, one that potentially opens new fronts with Canada, Cuba, and Panama, risks spreading American capacity even thinner. Analysts argue that trying to enforce a sphere of influence stretching from the Arctic to the Canal, while simultaneously confronting China in the Pacific and Russia in Europe, is a textbook recipe for overextension. And as past empires learned, overextension doesn't usually announce itself with a single dramatic collapse. It shows up first as quiet strain, stretched budgets, skeptical allies, and populations who get tired of paying the price. What makes the current moment so dangerous is that the human costs of this doctrine are already visible, even while the strategic benefits remain vague. To see that clearly, you just have to look at the people living in the shadow of these decisions. In Cuba, the doctrine isn't a think tank paper. It's a blackout that lasts through the night. It's a surgeon wondering how long the generators will hold, parents trying to keep food from spoiling, and students studying by candlelight because the grid keeps failing under the pressure of fuel shortages. The government in Havana stays in power, but ordinary people bear the brunt of an energy squeeze they never voted on. In Canada, the fallout is more subtle, but no less real. Trade policies and rhetorical threats inject uncertainty into cross-border business, making investors nervous and forcing companies to rethink long-standing assumptions about stability. For many Canadians, the idea that their closest ally would casually float the notion of absorbing their country, even as a negotiating ploy, feels like a betrayal of decades of partnership. In Europe, policymakers watch the Greenland debate and the Canal rhetoric and quietly ask themselves how far Washington is willing to go to enforce its will. For countries that have long treated the US as the anchor of a rules-based system, the sight of it flirting with expansionist language is profoundly unsettling. And then there's the impact inside the United States itself. Tariff battles and diplomatic rows with close partners often mean higher costs for American consumers and more uncertainty for American businesses, even as military and foreign policy commitments continue to drain resources. Critics argue that a doctrine branded as America First may, in practice, be making Americans poorer, more isolated, and less secure. All of this raises a deeper question. If the doctrine is creating more problems than it solves, what kind of world is it actually building? Around the world, governments are drawing their own conclusions from America's new posture. Some see Greater North America as a sign that Washington is shifting from a guardian of the system to a player willing to bend the rules whenever it suits its interests. Others view it as a moment of opportunity, a chance to deepen ties with China, Russia, or regional blocs as a hedge against unpredictable US behavior. Trade relationships that once defaulted to American leadership are quietly diversifying, with countries signing new agreements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America to reduce dependence on any single partner. Security arrangements are being re-examined too, as allies weigh the benefits of US protection against the risks of being caught in the crossfire of Washington's rivalries. If the post-1945 order was built on the assumption that America would broadly defend stable borders and predictable rules, the Greater North America doctrine pushes in the opposite direction, toward a world where major powers carve out zones of dominance and everyone else scrambles to adapt. That doesn't mean Canada will suddenly become a US state, or that Panama will quietly hand back its canal, or that Denmark will sell Greenland tomorrow. But it does mean the perception of American intentions is changing. Once that perception shifts, even if no tanks roll and no borders move, the behavior of other states follows, and the international system slowly reshapes itself around those new expectations. In that sense, the doctrine's most lasting impact may not be the map it dreams of drawing, but the chain reaction it sets off far beyond North America. And that brings us to the final question, not about policy, but about motive. So what is Greater North America really? Is it a serious long-term blueprint for reshaping the continent? Or is it a dramatic performance crafted for a domestic audience that rewards tough talk and bold threats? Some analysts argue that Trump's pattern has always been to start with maximalist demands, stir up controversy, and then settle for smaller, more symbolic wins he can sell as historic victories. From that angle, talking about buying Greenland, retaking the Panama Canal, or turning Canada into the 51st state might be less about literally doing those things and more about framing every negotiation as a struggle where only he has the courage to go that far. But even if the most extreme outcomes never happen, the language alone has consequences. For Cubans living through blackouts, for Canadians rethinking their closest alliance, for Europeans wondering whether the US still believes in the rules it wrote. In the end, history tends to judge leaders less by how loud they were and more by what they left behind. Stable institutions or fragile dependencies, trusted alliances or bitter resentments. Right now, the Greater North America Doctrine sits somewhere between grand strategy and political theater, between a map on a briefing room wall and a message aimed at voters at home. So I want to hear from you. Do you think this doctrine is a genuine vision for America's future? Or is it mainly about optics and influence? A show of strength designed for the cameras more than the history books? And if you're watching from Canada, the UK, or anywhere else inside this imagined Greater North America, how has this rhetoric changed the way you see the United States and its role in your future?